Good evening and welcome to Queer Town Hall. I'm Nancy Hawk, I'm the Executive Director of Basic Rights Oregon, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's Queer Town Hall, which will be on YouTube Live and Facebook Live. And tonight we're talking about voting during COVID-19. I've lived in Oregon a long time, and I've gotten the privilege to vote by mail, and I don't think I realized what a privilege it was until this year. And I lived in DC for 5 years in the early 2000s, and one year I was on the road, I was working on the presidential campaign, and then the following big election, I got to vote at a ballot box for the first time in my life, and there was a really long line. I was wearing a button. And multiple people told me that I was electioneering, and I didn't know what that was exactly. People were crocheting in line, people were just like hanging in there because we had to wait so long to vote. And I was like, this is stupid. I don't like this. And then once I was in the actual ballot box place, I was like, I don't have enough time to decide all these things. I don't know who these judges are. Where's my booklet? And so I was then that I started gaining more of an appreciation for our system in Oregon. But this year with COVID-19 and what happened in Wisconsin really made me sort of see just like how valuable vote by mail is for our democracy. So for those who don't know, Wisconsin had a primary on April 7th, and the Supreme Court decided that in-person voting would continue. And so it was pandemonium where there was numerous polls closed throughout the state. People were waiting in long lines at their polling locations, of course, and people were put in an impossible position to vote in the election or risking their life, right? And people, and so it felt really scary, and it just felt like, why would we have this system? And so it feels like right now there's a national conversation happening around vote by mail, and people are really looking at Oregon's system. And I don't know if you've noticed, but you don't have to put a stamp on your ballot this year, which is really exciting. So tonight we have an amazing group of people who are going to talk about both what happened in Wisconsin. We have a special guest, Megin McDonell, the Executive Director of Fair Wisconsin. And then we also have some Oregonians who are really active in politics who are going to jump in and talk about what it's like to be working on elections during this time, and also some of the history of how we got to vote by mail.
My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the Executive Director currently of Oregon Futures Lab and ColorPAC. I've learned that I actually am much more deeply an introvert than I thought I was. In this job, you have to be an ambivert, really, like working with people and working alone. But I really prize and treasure my alone time, and I've learned that that's a great thing. So thanks, COVID, for that, I guess.
Thanks. Let's move on to Eric.
Good evening, everyone.
Okay. Yes, I'm here. Okay. Welcome to Queer Town Hall. Sorry for the delays. It feels like we're still having some technical issues, but we're gonna keep going. So welcome everybody. Tonight we're talking about voting during COVID. And we're gonna also discuss how great vote by mail is and how everybody across the country should do it. And so I'm not going to do a long intro because I already did one, because I want to a lovely guest, and I'm going to actually go ahead and start from the top again and let all of our panelists introduce themselves. We're going to start with Ana del Rocío. So
thanks, Nancy. My name is Ana del Rocío. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I currently serve as the executive director of Oregon Futures Lab. You had asked the second question, like, what's one good thing that I learned during COVID? And I said, I know for sure now that I'm an introvert, and I love it. So that's my gratitude piece for COVID.
That's great. Thank you. Let's move on to Eric.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Eric Delahoy. I am the chair of the Basic Rights Oregon Equality PAC Board. We support LGBTQ and equality-focused candidates throughout the state of Oregon. And my pronouns are he, him, his. And what I've learned is how to build community within our neighborhood. I think too often we forget about our neighbors around us with our busy lives, and COVID has allowed me to get to know a lot of folks that way. I've been checking in on seniors and doing grocery runs and just taking a little bit of a pause and trying to build community during this time.
Great. And Jeanne, did you make it onto Zoom? I don't see Jeanne, so I'm going to have our special guest star from all the way from Wisconsin introduce herself.
All right, I'm Megin McDonell. Let's see, organization. I'm the executive director of FAIR Wisconsin, which is sort of a counterpart organization to Basic Rights Oregon. We're a statewide LGBTQ plus civil rights organization. And my pronouns are she, her. And one thing that I learned, I don't know if this is positive or negative, but that Zoom meetings and so forth are kind of hard when you have bifocals, because I realized they do lots of things when I'm just working on my computer. But to like engage with people, I always look like I'm squinting, because I am, because I'm like, we're trying to find the focus. So it was something interesting I learned. And also, if I look squinting or angry, I'm just, visually challenged. So.
They're just looking at our faces, and that's a good thing. Okay, alphabetical, Samantha, Sammy. I decided to go Samantha.
Hey, I'm Samantha Gladue, the executive director of Next Up, formerly the Bus Project, she, her, hers. And something I have learned is really how to prioritize. Like, not everything has to happen at once, and this pandemic has made it so clear.
And Sammy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sammy Alloy, and I work with the More Treatment campaign, Yes on IP44. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I think one gift that this pandemic has given me is that I have an 8-month-old baby, and my spouse and I are both able to work from home and trade off being with her. And so it's really given me the opportunity to spend a lot of time with the baby and take the opportunity to slow it down a little bit. And I know that's not the case for everyone who has kids of different ages. So I feel really fortunate to get to have this really precious time.
That's great. Thank you. I know a lot of people, a lot of us, it's the most time we've gotten to spend with our kids since they were born. So yeah, it's a really interesting time. I'll say one thing I've learned is that I can do all sorts of things that I didn't know about. Like today I made an obstacle course on the sidewalk with sidewalk chalk. And in this time, I know people are going to use it. And Jeanne Atkins has joined us. Wonderful. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Happy to. I'm Jeanne Atkins. I currently have no organizational affiliation, which is something I've been striving for a number of months, trying to retire, but I was Secretary of State for Oregon in the last big election cycle, and served as Democratic Party chair after that. So it's she for hers, and it's very interesting being in stay-at-home mode and being retired. I really am having the experience of getting up in the morning and saying, I can decide what I'm going to do today. Only a few obligations like this, which I love having when I have them, but I'm also enjoying that time to figure out what I want, how I want to spend the next stage of my life.
That's wonderful. I imagine one day I'll be able to read a book again.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's go ahead and dive into the questions. And I think that I wanted to start today by talking with Megan from Wisconsin, and just hearing from someone who was on the ground during that time, a little bit about the Wisconsin primary. I feel like it was such a sort of lesson for all of us and across the country who care about democracy, seeing people risk their lives to vote in a primary, and for the Supreme Court to make the decision that it did, that it could go on despite the pandemic. So if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about what happened in Wisconsin and maybe how especially it affected historically marginalized voters.
Thanks. So, so in Wisconsin, our statewide stay-at-home orders started around like the middle of March and were originally scheduled to go, mid-April. They've now since been extended like a lot of places, but right in the middle of that was our statewide spring primary, which was also our presidential primary on April 7th. Part of why that was so important is actually, at this point, the presidential primary is was not really the key issue that kind of got us to everything that happened. The bigger context really is that we also had a statewide Supreme Court race, which was very contentious and very, an extremely conservative incumbent who is not good on any issues that probably any of us in this virtual room or audience, care about. And we also had hundreds and hundreds of local races. So county board supervisors, county board chairs, school boards, city councils, mayor and county executive of Milwaukee, which is the biggest city and the biggest county in Wisconsin. So a lot at stake, which, made it difficult to make a decision about whether or not to delay the election. And originally, unfortunately also our governor, didn't really have time on his side as far as the timing of everything just really couldn't have been worse. It was like, you're literally looking at the need to have people stay home this election in 2 weeks. There's no time to, shift easily to any other mode other than, with the in-person voting that we normally have. So we also have very divided government. We have a new in 2018, but, somewhat newly elected Democratic governor, but all still Republican control of the entire legislature, conservative control of the Supreme Court. And it is very partisan in Wisconsin. It's not just divided, but it's extremely antagonistic as well. So all of those different factors coming together, to make it really difficult. And then on top of that, we have not really had voting by mail before. I mean, we have absentee voting that people can do by mail, but usually that's just been, older people who are sort of indefinitely confined is the term that we use, at least in our state law, military voters, things like that. We did a few years ago have a lawsuit that basically forced the state, despite some of the conservative objections to, expanding voting opportunities for people. So that we have in-person absentee voting. So we don't have true early voting the way some states have, but it's in-person absentee voting. So you can go to your municipal clerk or to your library for about 2.5 weeks before the in-person election day, fill out an actual absentee ballot there, put it in the envelope. It has to be sealed and witnessed and everything. And then those votes are all collected and distributed to the various polling places on election day and processed on election day at those polling places in a normal year. So trying to figure out how to shift all of this in this extremely short time period is kind of what led to all these lawsuits and all of the controversy. On top of that, we also have, you know, the most racially segregated city and county and state in the country. We have a terrible, terrible history of racial disparities, especially for the African American community. It's very, you can read tons about it. So there's also there were a lot of racial dynamics as far as, you know, I'm trying to think of how to describe this, but that the sort of conservative and progressive, you know, conflict, and how that plays out in the context of this very sort of intense, you know, history of racism, systemic racism, and its effects in Wisconsin, you know, is kind of what all sort of came together for this, like, you know, perfect storm of a really, you know, shameful thing that we had to have, you know, we were sort of forced to have to continue having the in-person voting on election day. But, you know, another piece of that was that there's also, understandably, a lot of, frankly, a lot of distrust in the African-American communities in particular of things like mailing and voting. So, you know, civic engagement groups, you know, we're part of the C3 and the C4 civic engagement and, you know, electoral tables, and working with all of the groups around the state, you know, doing all this ballot chasing and all the programs that, you know, we all do as state equality groups. You know, people were finding that, like, there's a big chunk of the community that really just doesn't trust voting other than to go to their polling place. And, you know, they see their ballot going into the machine getting counted, and they have more trust with that. And that sending it off in the mail, they're like, I don't know, how do I believe my ballot's even going to get counted anyway? So we had to do things like, you know, getting the clerks to install secure ballot drop boxes, and also because, you know, besides the trust issues, there was also this issue of the mail service itself being delayed due to COVID-19. So that, you know, normally you could request your absentee ballot, it gets mailed to you, that only takes a day or two, you can turn around and, you know, mail it back, and all of that can happen within a week or less. But you know, under all of the circumstances, the Postal Service saying, well, you know, you really should assume that it's going to take at least a week each direction. We already were less than 2 weeks from Election Day. So, you know, that also is what led to one of the lawsuits asking for the extension to receive ballots. But the, you know, conservative factions and the Republican Party, I mean, it was specifically the RNC and the Republican Party of Wisconsin were the plaintiffs in one of the cases. They were, you know, having more people in Milwaukee and Dane counties, which are the most liberal counties in Wisconsin, being able to get their ballots in was not in their interest. So they were, you know, objecting to everything that they could to try to cut those windows off so that, you know, our ballots would just get lost in the mail and never make it back in time in order for them to be counted. So, you know, probably, I mean, we're still figuring out what the lessons learned are. But, you know, they're yeah, we're still figuring it out, but there are many, and for states who are having to try to sort of shift programs, you know, there are a lot of things that you can look at to see how things went in Wisconsin. And unfortunately, we did have, you know, at least some, you know, is it statistically significant? I don't know, but there have been cases, COVID cases that have been traced, you know, sort of through the contact tracing method, like traced back to Election Day, both voters and some poll workers, and, you know, countless others. I mean, we all saw the pictures and, you know, stuff on CNN around the country that there's no way people didn't get sick from having to go out and vote. So
yeah, that's really it's an absurd, crazy thing like that people have to deal with, and that decision about voting in an election that's really important to them. So we're going to come back to you to hear more about Wisconsin, but I sort of just want to contrast that a little bit to voting in Oregon, which has been all vote by mail for quite a while. And we're really honored tonight to have former Secretary of State Jeanne Atkins with us. And Jeanne, can you just give us a little bit of that history of how we became a vote by mail state and how we avoided people having to wait in long lines during a global pandemic?
Don't you think of that every time you see the news on election night and people are waiting outside in big long lines? How grateful we are that we don't do that. Well, Governor Brown and some of the other, who was a former Secretary of State, for those of you who don't know, and other former Secretaries of State really kind of love to tell the story of how we came to do vote by mail. So many of you may have heard it before, but it started with a county clerk in Lynn County who had one special election in particular. He was concerned about turnout in those middle elections, the non-presidential, the non-congressional elections. And there was some money measure, I think, having to do with schools in Lynn County that basically 2 voters participated. And he was very unhappy about that. Not a progressive by any means, not somebody who had a political agenda of any kind, but just wanted people to participate. And he'd heard about counties and other states that were beginning to explore vote by mail, and he began to advocate through the county clerks, among them and his local state legislators and so forth, that counties be allowed to try this out and to do this with local county elections. He was persuasive and persistent in that effort. And so it's almost 40 years ago now that the legislature passed a bill allowing for a test with local elections that counties could choose to participate in, doing them vote by mail. And it was an instant success. It showed, a huge increase in participation. And so by 1987, that was in 1981, by 1987, it was made permanent for local and special elections. That's how they would be handled. It still took another decade after that for us to get to the full vote by mail system, including the statewide and federal elections. I think there's a couple of things in that story that are important about why we were able to kind of be first in the nation on that whole program. And part of it was that it came from the local level. It wasn't really a bright idea by a statewide official or by a political entity. And it was an advocacy by clerks that led to this. For any of our listeners who may not recognize it, elections in every state are run mostly by local officials. The state may have laws as to how it's supposed to be done, as Oregon does, but in fact, the elections process, whether it's developing ballots, getting them to people, counting, collecting ballots and counting them, is largely funded by and operated by local county officials. So even for Oregon, I think it was really kind of important that it came from the ground up. And those of us, and there are folks in this group who've worked on other elections reforms, that it's really important for the clerks to feel like this is something that they can trust. They feel they're on the line for the validity of this, and their community is going to hold them responsible if it doesn't go well. So getting them as partners are really important. All the same, if you look back at the press and the legislative history of this, all the same arguments and criticisms that you hear now were arguments that took place. There's a lot of sentiment about going to the polls. People missed their polling places and found that to be a social activity that they wanted to continue. The worry about fraud, how do you know the right person got their hands on that ballot? How do you know the right person, signed the ballot? Would the Postal Service be able to handle those securely? All of that was of concern, but after election after election after election after election took place, and there were not, reports or complaints or any evidence that a lot of fraud was happening, or that people were not routinely getting their ballots, or that the ballots were not routinely getting to the counties. After, you know, that much experience and that much data, people really trusted it. That's sort of how we, you know, got to this. Many of the other states that have set up vote by mail, Colorado, California, Washington in particular, I know, have kind of added another element to it that Oregon has not, which is that there be voting assistance centers of some kind, maybe to try to help get over the trust issues that some communities might have about sending their ballot into oblivion, but also the, you know, progressive groups nationally didn't jump on Oregon's experience right off the bat and start advocating for vote by mail. I mean, it's kind of it's interesting to see the dynamic move when we've obviously come up against a situation where this looks like one of the better solutions to make sure democracy continues. But 2 years ago, that wasn't the conversation that we were even having with national organizations as much as we were all sort of pressing vote by mail. I'm happy to talk, and maybe we can do it later, but, you know, sort of effect on turnout and, you know, what does it mean to making sure that people get access. I have more things I could talk about, but I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you. We actually already have questions in, but I'm gonna start with a few more of my own before I move to those questions. And why don't we move next to Samantha, because I know Next Up has done a lot of amazing work expanding voting rights, and I feel like we're still working on it here, and the experiment continues. Continue to improve our systems here. So you want to talk a little bit about what you've been up to?
Yeah, the experiment definitely continues, right? This week, the Secretary of State in Oregon announced that because of automatic voter registration, 91% of eligible Oregonians are registered, which is incredible, right? But we're not going to stop until we get to universal suffrage, where every single eligible Oregonian is registered. And there's always so much that we can do to make sure that we're continuing to fine-tune the election system. A chief example of that is paid postage for ballots. In 2019, after years of advocacy, we finally passed paid postage for ballots, which means that not only are we voting at home during this pandemic, but we don't even have to leave to drop our ballot off. Every mailbox is a drop site, which is so cool. And that's amazing. So thank you so much to everyone who helped make that happen, right? But there are more things that we can do. And right now we're spending a lot of time getting out the vote. We tend to prioritize young Oregonians. We want to make sure that we are in the top 5 nationally for turnout with young voters. And as young voters are becoming an increasing share of the voting bloc, that's even a bigger task, right? So instead of getting out and going door to door, we're having no in-person contact, and we're doing texts and calls. And it's really interesting because it's actually resulting in us being able to contact more people and more quickly. We really miss being in person, but we're definitely able to reach a lot of people right now. And it's not a spectator support, right? It really takes a community effort. So if you're watching this and you haven't yet gotten involved with getting out the vote, hit up Next Up or Basic Rights or APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, and so many other organizations, because everyone's doing phone banks and text banks right now, and it's really fun over Zoom. Again, you don't have to leave your house, and it's a great way to volunteer. And then looking ahead to 2021 is something we're also doing. We know that so much of the legislature is turning over right now. We're going to have a new Secretary of State. And more importantly, though, like regardless of all of that, we have to continue to carry the ball forward on elections policy. So we're going to be introducing a suite of elections equity bills, ranging from more in language materials to collecting demographic information with voter registration and candidate filings, so we no longer have to guess. That's a really important one, because in the voter file, demographic information is modeled off of consumer data. So anecdotally, I have heard stories of community leaders who are people of color being coded as white in the voter file, which makes it really hard to actually organize a community. And also it makes it just ridiculous to be able to tell whether or not our forms of government are working how they should, or truly representing all people, because we end up not being able to tell whether there are racialized voting patterns where communities are voting at a certain rate compared to others, or for different candidates rather than others. And when we get into the nitty-gritty of districting and at large versus zoned, it's hard to make an informed decision about how to move forward until we have that data, so we can really build power with historically disenfranchised communities. And another thing we want to do, two more big things that I'll get to, are modernizing the voting age, right? So last year, we also introduced a bill to modernize the voting age and lower it to 16. And we know that there are a lot of steps in between that need to shift the culture and the hearts and minds of people until they're comfortable to do that. So we're going to be making some baby steps toward that. And the other really big thing that we want to focus on is prisons, right? So there are people in our jails in counties who are eligible to vote, but are not, because there's this patchwork of policies throughout counties where not everybody is being given access to voting information and voting materials. We want to fix that. And we also want to make sure that people serving time for felonies are re-enfranchised. Back in the 1970s, Oregon took that right away, and it just takes a simple majority in the legislature to give it back.
Thanks, Samantha. So one thing Samantha mentioned was
in the legislature,
voters of color and how they might be, their demographic info might be a little off. For instance, if you just had consumer data for me, my last name is Arabic. So I get, you know, all sorts of mail, all sorts of consumer data that thinks I speak Arabic, and I definitely don't. So yeah, a lot of that information is really flawed. But I feel like it does bring up the issue of folks in marginalized communities and folks of color. And I know, Anna, you've done amazing work with supporting people running for election right now. And how is it going?
It's going. So, you know, the challenges that candidates of color are facing now in 2020 post-COVID, in some ways are no different than the technical challenges that a candidate of any race would be facing. The difference is where it lies within the trajectory, the pattern of candidates of color in Oregon. 4 years ago, we had 9 candidates of color that Oregon Futures Lab and ColorPAC were supporting for election to office in the primary. This cycle, we have 39. So wow. There's obviously been a very rapid pace. What it tells us is a lot of things. It tells us that, you know, even through Trump, even through perceived threats, communities of color are focused on building the political power that we need to demand for our communities to be able to thrive. At the same time, we also know that communities of color are disproportionately being harmed and feeling the impacts of COVID. And having to survive a trauma like COVID, because COVID is trauma, is not a way to increase voter turnout. So when we look at elections as a whole, and this idea of integrated voter engagement, this idea of looking at low propensity, quote unquote, voters, folks who have not been very active in elections beforehand, but we want to encourage campaigns and candidates and all campaigns really to be targeting and encouraging to vote. If there's more instability in those populations, right? There's more housing instability, people are sick. There's gonna be a perception of, you know, it's kind of like a, last in, first out, where it's, our fear is that it's gonna undo some of the progress we've made on making both the candidacies and the electorates more representative. And what we are seeing is that candidates of color as a whole, in Oregon at least, are still as human as everybody else, and they're having to deal with, you know, our sick families and our kids, and making sure that we're staying, you know, somewhat stable while we're going and talking to our likely voters and unlikely voters as well. So, as a whole, you know, the trend is we're running in more places. We're also having a harder time being able to push through the challenges that COVID poses to still continue to reach voters. it still requires highly trained and skilled organizing. You can get phones and texts and do all your things online, you know, virtual town halls. It still requires organizing to be able to thread for people, oh wow, COVID's really messing with us, to one way to solve this, or one way to work to heal communities from COVID, is to make sure we have the right decision makers in power. And that takes skill to draw those things together for people, because when you're facing trauma and you're really trying to get by, trauma has a way of freezing your way of thinking. It's hard to think politics. It's hard to think broader change. And it's a big job for a candidate to have to do, much less candidates of color who are trying to push past the inherent bias in whether or not we're quote unquote qualified or fit to serve. One other thing that I see coming down is government in Oregon. We've been dealing with revenue issues for a long time, but in recovering from COVID in this recession, as candidates of color are entering office more and more, we're going to be the ones having to take the blame and having to solve and having to deal with an inheritance of a very broken and troubled system of policies, or lack of some policies, broken revenue mechanisms, and take the brunt of the blowback when it comes to people that have relied on these services and are going to be seeing government really, really struggle in the years to come. We see that in any field or industry where you're increasing the representation of folks who have previously not been represented. If it's women, people of color, we get in there and there's that whole glass cliff dynamic where we're put in positions and have to undo a lot of damage that had been done before we came along. So we're seeing that the challenge is to keep morale up. The challenge is to keep fundraising up, because it's expensive to do phone banks, and it's expensive to buy the data that's needed. That Samantha was referencing. You know, we want to know where our folks are, and that's really hard data to come by. So it's expensive. Candidates need donations. If folks want to check out some of the people that are running, they can go to Oregon Futures Lab website and take a look at the folks in 22 different counties that are running for office, and check out some of their profiles, and send them some encouragement, at least, if not a donation, because it's really an act of service to want to lead in this time.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I feel like it's so true. It's like, oh, want to lead a state where 300,000 people just had to apply for unemployment?
I mean,
our job,
right? For like very little to no money, right? Like these are positions, yeah. It's not like DC. These are very low to no paying jobs out here. So
right. Eric, do you want to tell us a little bit about how Basic Rights Oregon, where we could find information about our Equality PAC?
Sure. I think we could actually post a link in, I think we can post a link in the kind of chat function for folks to follow up. But on the website, you can go to the website, you go to About, and then you'll scroll down from that to Equality PAC, and then you'll have a quick link to the endorsements, and that will have our endorsements, which are our legislative and statewide candidates. They go through a full interview process with us. And then we have our green lights, which are more of our local folks who go through more of just an application process, and they have pledged to support all of our issues. For those candidates who are incumbent, we follow up and do a fast track endorsement with them after checking and making sure that they have supported and championed the bills that Basic Rights Oregon thinks are essential in terms of equity throughout the state. So that's the best way to do that.
That's great. Thanks, Eric. And next, I want to go to Sammy, because you have this sort of unenviable job right now of trying to gather signatures during a global pandemic. And you're working on a really important ballot initiative, IP44, which Basic Rights Oregon has already endorsed. You're the first to ask. And you got the endorsement while we were still able to have meetings in person. Tell us a little bit about what IP44 is, what it's going to do, and how it's been trying to run this campaign.
Thanks so much, Nancy. IP44, it won't be called that when it reaches your November ballot. It will be assigned a ballot measure number. So it's also known as the More Treatment Campaign. It seeks to change Oregon's approach to drug policy and shift from a criminalized approach to a more humane and healthcare-based approach to folks who use drugs. So we know that the current approach to drug policy in Oregon and in the nation is cruel and ineffective. Criminalizing people who are addicted to drugs is unfair and harsh, and we know that it doesn't work and it doesn't help people recover. Even a minor drug offense can set up lifelong barriers to basic needs like housing, education, employment, and immigration. Meanwhile, Oregon has a crisis of addiction and a crisis of inaccess to treatment. Oregon is 50th in the nation in terms of access to treatment and recovery services for those who want to recover. Meanwhile, where almost 1 in 10 Oregonians over the age of 12 is suffering from substance use disorder. We have 1 to 2 Oregonians dying every single day of an overdose. And during COVID, getting those vital harm reduction and healthcare services to people experiencing houselessness and drug addiction is even more of a crisis and putting even more of a strain on our healthcare systems. So what the More Treatment campaign is proposing is that we create $60 to $100 million a year in public funding for drug treatment, harm reduction, peer-supported recovery, and housing for those who need sober and stabilization housing. Meanwhile, it will take what are currently misdemeanor offenses, those lowest level offenses of simple drug possession, so possession for personal use, and take those from a criminal offense to a civil violation. So it does not legalize any drugs, but it will take those minor drug offenses and convert them to a violation more like getting a traffic ticket. So it removes the opportunity for folks to face those harsh consequences and barriers to getting access to their basic needs. And it also sets up a way for people to get their fine forgiven if they seek substance use assessment from a healthcare provider. So really, converting that those criminal penalties into a way for people to get help that they need and deserve. And we also know, of course, that that the war on drugs has set up, cruel and harsh disparities for communities of color and for the LGBTQ+ community. As queer people, we are 3 times as likely to have an interaction with the police or experience incarceration in a year as sexual majority communities. We know that Black and white Oregonians use drugs at similar rates, but African Americans are 3 times more likely to be arrested on a drug offense. So we're really seeking to take the next step that Oregon is ready for and decriminalize those offenses and get folks access to the help that they need. So Nancy, you mentioned the unique challenge of campaigning during COVID, and that is that Oregon has a citizen initiative petition system where we can put ballot measures onto the ballot, and it's a great way for voters to signify to the legislature that they're ready to support an issue. It's a campaigning around a ballot measure is a way to change hearts and minds, to have a big cultural conversation and create a big wave of support and activism around an issue. And it often, those wins snowball. When Oregon legalized and regulated marijuana, we then were able to expunge prior marijuana offenses for people who had marijuana offenses, right? So we know that this is a really important function of our democracy, and we need to defend it. But during COVID, the way that ballot measures qualify for the ballot is that we have to get over 112,000 signatures from voters to appear on the November ballot. And we are very lucky because the More Treatment campaign started early with our signature gathering, and we were almost done when the social distancing restrictions went into place, but we're not there yet. So we have had to, Oregonians, I'm sure many of you are used to seeing signature gatherers on the train, at the farmer's market, in front of the grocery store, asking if you're a registered voter and if you want to help get an issue on the ballot. And so we had to pull all those individuals from the field and start experimenting with unique methods of gathering signatures that campaigns haven't done before. We're doing mail, text messages, gathering signatures with email blasts and online. So if you want to sign the petition, you can go to yesonip44.org, and there's a button there that you can click on to download the petition. It's easy to do. It only takes a minute, but you do have to print a physical petition, because we're working within Secretary of State guidelines, so it has to be a hard copy. You have to print it, sign it, and then put it in the mail back to us. And of course, many of the communities that we're seeking to serve don't have a printer or a stamp at home. So there is a way that if you go and click that link, you'll be able to get in touch. An organizer will be in touch with you and send you a petition in the mail that you'll be able to fill out and return. But those methods of gathering signatures are much more time consuming than going out to a farmer's market and gathering them in bulk. And so we are asking the communities that are supportive of the measure and voters who want to see this critical measure on the ballot to go to that link, yesonip44.org, and help us out by signing it. You could go drop it off on your neighbor's front porch and ask them to sign it, and then go pick it up later and, follow social distance regulations. And so we're having to do some creative strategies to help people get out into their community and gather signatures from their friends and family and loved ones.
Thank you for that, Sammy. And we actually have a bunch of questions from folks who are watching, and I want to get started. It sounds like maybe someone spilled a cup of coffee on their ballot, and they really want to know, is it possible to get a new ballot? And they're very excited maybe to hear from Jeanne or Samantha about how someone could get a new ballot. Oh, Jeanne, you're still muted.
Samantha would have been faster than I. Yes, you can get a new ballot. I did a full focus group actually with some folks who were post-prison, under post-prison supervision, and it was voter registration day, and we wanted them to understand that they could participate in this. And one of the things they said, this looks like one of those tests at school, and I would always mark the wrong box, and I don't want to do that. He wasn't ready to take that responsibility. And so we know that there's 1,000 ways to screw up a ballot, and yes, you can get another one. There are two directions I think you can go. Samantha may say there are advocacy groups that can be even quicker. You can go to your county clerk's office, either on the web or contact them directly and ask about getting a new ballot, ask to have a new one sent. You can go to OregonVotes.org/myvote and do a lot of different things about tracking your ballot, tracking your, finding out where there's a ballot box near to you, make sure that your registration is as you want it to be, and see if you want to make any changes in that. Other suggestions, Samantha? What do you think?
You covered it. Yeah, I would go to the county elections office, probably call them, because during this pandemic, they, want to make sure that they're there and that you have a time, but they will just print you another one. It's awesome. It doesn't take very long also.
That's great. We also had a question, and maybe you could take it, Samantha, since you're already talking, about who are the 9% who aren't registered? I feel like our state's working really hard to get everybody registered.
Yeah, I would love to know, right? Especially because it's only about 300,000 people. It's a little less than that. And I feel like we are kind of looking under the couch cushions to identify where the 9% are. And we do know that it's people who do not interact with the Department of, with the DMV. I always want to say some other acronym than what it is here in Oregon. But it's people who don't interact with the DMV. And that could be any number of folks, but our inkling is that it's communities who have been historically disenfranchised, looking for Black, Indigenous, people of color, people who are involved with the legal system and maybe think that they're ineligible but don't register, and people with intellectual, mental, and mobility needs that don't end up voting or getting registered.
Thanks for that.
I would also add the elderly to that, because in fact, if you bring your parents to Oregon as they're aging to come and live with you, you're probably not going to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles for any reason. So that's a population that gets missed. Now, when we first started automatic voter registration, we tracked for a long time, because it is possible for people to say, no, don't register me. Get away from me with your voter registration. I don't want to be registered to vote. And in those early, the first year of automatic voter registration, it was running in the 4 to 5 to 7% of folks would feedback that they didn't want to be registered to vote. So there is that population that's there as well.
True.
The More Treatment campaign has heard from a number of people who want to vote for IP44 for the first time, as a new voter, because people who have been, who have experienced incarceration from a prior drug offense, they might not know that they're eligible to vote because other states disenfranchise people with previous convictions. They might not go to the DMV because they don't have a car or they're experiencing houselessness. So, we know that for folks who are in recovery, that getting re-enfranchised and getting access to the ballot, that this issue is particularly important.
Thanks for that. And Megan, I had a question for you. It feels like, at least here, like many people who work in politics, I get asked a lot about who should I vote for? And then people always go, ugh, judges.
Yes.
Like you just had a really important primary that was pretty focused on a judge. Can you tell us a little bit about how that played out?
Yeah, so the judicial branch is really of utmost importance. And, so to answer your question, we had this, this particular, race was a state Supreme Court race. Our state Supreme Court is elected, it's 10-year terms. It is nonpartisan officially, although it's really nonpartisan in name only, in the sense that, on both sides, both the Democratic and Republican parties do put a lot of resources into candidate recruitment, supporting candidates, that are running. So it really is kind of, like I said, nonpartisan in name only. And judicial candidates aren't supposed to necessarily have opinions or philosophies on, well, they can have philosophies, but not, opinions on issues that might come before them. But still, you can learn a lot about judicial candidates from things that they've written in the past. If they are currently a judge, decisions that they've made. You can really see, how a judicial candidate would be expected to think about issues of equality and civil rights, and not just for the LGBTQ communities, but for communities of color. So it really, I don't like in just a few more seconds, I don't know how to say how important it is, but it really is sometimes a lot, the overlooked branch. And the fact that we had the election that we had to have because of decisions at the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, with all of the sort of political influences on those judges, the judges aren't always independent. They're looking at, maybe it sounds cynical, but it's hard to believe that there weren't, people high up in the Trump administration putting pressure on the people who they've appointed to the United States Supreme Court to have a favorable outcome for the Wisconsin State Supreme Court when, we're one of the states that's possibly going to make or break the November election. And our, November election in Wisconsin could easily also end up in our state Supreme Court, just like, Bush v. Gore. So So yeah, so judicial candidates from the county circuit judges all the way up are extremely important for issues of civil rights. It's not new. I could talk about that for hours. So, but I won't because we only have a few minutes.
Well, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about like, what are some of your thoughts about, you did this GOTV, right, to get votes for the Supreme Court judge, Karofsky, I think?
Yeah, Karofsky was the more liberal or progressive candidate.
Yeah, and like, what can we learn from that sort of like, I mean, I'm not sure if I would
actually, yeah, I think
like,
so some of it was in terms of the like GOTV and things like that. It was a lot of it was just, I mean, our coalitions were having like up to in the last week, like daily check-in calls at 4. All the groups were just coming together on Zoom and trying to like sort of debrief and rebrief each other on how things were going. And we were just desperately trying to do everything we could think of that we were allowed to do within these continuous, judicial decisions that kept rolling out, to get those ballots in, and doing it in the context of all of these issues we've been talking about, people that have, communities that are just basically, I mean, conservatives trying to disenfranchise at every possible turn because, that was a lot of, pivoting. We were kind of joking. We're like, we're going to try to not use the word pivot in any of these, this one call, and like nobody could do it. It was, just constant pivoting, restructuring. Like I said, another, well, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think we're all a little bit pressed, right, on how to do GOTV during this time. I wonder, Anna and Eric, if you can talk a little bit about, we're all getting mailers every day, but how do we really support the candidates that we care about right now? What are some of the best ways?
There's a few different ways, I think, in my opinion, and Eric might have some different or additional ideas too. One is just to really play the role that you can in your community, in your family, in your neighborhood, around encouraging and reminding folks to continue to vote. For a while, when we early on knew that there would be stay-at-home orders, there was a question about, okay, well, if people are home and ballots are being mailed to their homes, does that mean that they'll maybe vote like in higher numbers? And then we quickly saw with census return rates that actually no, people are, we very reasonably occupied with other things. So we are looking at a dip in normal voter turnout rates. So it's incumbent upon folks who do understand, who are pushing through obstacles to be able to still access the vote, to also support in your communities and your neighborhoods to get out the vote as well. That's in general. Turnout is a big deal for candidates. And then for specific issues, I think do your research, find out who's on the ballot, look at different organizations, voter guides, candidate guides, really get a sense of who it is that could potentially be in office. And then really just do your best to vote on every single one, including the judicial races, right? There's a lot of them that are unopposed, but many of them that are contested races. And those are super, super important to vote on as well.
Great, thanks. Eric, do you want to jump in?
Sure, definitely what Anna said is, I think, probably one of the biggest things that we've noticed just as a PAC is how, of course, COVID has just turned this entire cycle just upside down in terms of how, candidates campaign, how PACs operate, and just the challenges of even being able to get together and have an event, and to raise money and things like that to support candidates. And so we've talked about on the PAC board is really how do we as a board get involved? And so we are supporting various candidates individually in the primary, and then of course we'll do so in the general election. But certainly there's a lot of need for getting things, stamps, addresses on things, texting, calling, online fundraisers that are happening. Of course, we're all probably living right now in Zoom fatigue, but there are a lot of opportunities to get on and actually spend more time with your candidates to be able to even look at things that have been recorded versus even being live. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there. I think you can utilize your affinity, organizations and the PACs. You can look at ColorPAC and you can look at EPAC and look at who the endorsements are and see how they line up on our particular issues if you need some help with that particular way. So, and of course, we're all still taking donations. Candidates are taking donations. Shameless plug for the EPAC if anyone's interested in donating. What we do is we figure out where those really critical races are, where we can actually flip a seat, where we have a very tight race where some influence or influx of money from our PAC can make a difference there. So there's ways you can be strategic about how you utilize your funds without having to do all that research yourself as well. And I think the other thing that's really critical, we have the primary coming up in a couple weeks, and I think a lot of times, the presidential primary is over, for the Democratic primary, which tends to be mostly our folks. But it's so critical that we get out there and we vote for all of our local and regional folks. They're the people who actually make the decisions that impact our lives the most. They may not be the sexiest races or the ones where everyone knows the names, but if you don't support your local folks, it just doesn't matter. We're kind of that firewall, and Oregon has such a progressive nature and reputation. We have to keep that going. So please vote for sure.
Great. And so we actually just had another question about judges, popular topic tonight. But someone was wondering, because, when you're voting for a candidate, especially someone who's been in office, you can just look up their voting record on the issues you care about. And it's a little more confusing around judges. So if someone wants to know about a particular judge, what's the process? And so far they've Googled, but wondering what else is there?
Well, your voter's pamphlet obviously is a really important starting place, and yeah, right up there. And you should probably consider the endorsements that are there, and then maybe Google those people if they're unfamiliar to you. They may have a connection to an organization or some piece of their background that then helps you understand a little better who is there. It's really true. It's true of us all, as committed as we are, that those uncontested judicial races are something we just kind of blurrily go through. But as Anna said, there are several now that are contested, and they are county by county, so it isn't always possible to speak in broad terms about them. We do have two, I think one Supreme Court judge and one Court of Appeals in Oregon judge who are being challenged and are in contested races. But I think the voter's pamphlet information is pretty clear about sort of where the support for each of them lies and what their arguments are about it. And some of that you just gotta, your opinion matters, how those words strike you and what you think about what the argument that's being made. Trust yourself.
Samantha?
I would add also, looking at a judge and seeing by whom they were appointed is really important, because a lot of the judges who are on this ballot were appointed by a governor. And in the case of Governor Brown, maybe you align with her more or trust her appointments, right? And there's increasingly a movement for more conservative judicial candidates to be challenging these judicial appointees who were put there by Governor Brown. And we're seeing that as a threat, and how, the judiciary is so important. And if this does continue, this trend of the judiciary becoming more of a battleground on the ballot, we're going to have to pay even closer attention. So I really appreciate that question of how to find out more about judges.
I'd also say that I ended up Googling a bunch of judges who I didn't know anything about. You can get a lot of information that way. So it's not bad, you know, find the information you need. Sammy?
I know from having worked with criminal justice reform candidates in the past that legal associations like the Oregon Bar Association host judicial debates. So if you really want to be a nerd about researching your choice for judges, that certainly those are on YouTube, and there may be other legal associations and organizations like the ACLU or the Oregon League of Women Voters who may not take a political position but may be interested in civil liberties or voter education that would that host judicial candidate debates like that as well.
That's great. So Megan?
I have one more tip too. In addition, those are all great tips that I would add or, you know, agree with. And one last one is just that also when you're Googling, it can be fairly easy to find out like what associations that the, you know, person, if they're a practicing attorney or currently a judge or, you know, what have you. Like the Federalist Society, for example, is extremely conservative organization that, you know, advocates for certain judicial philosophies that are often completely the opposite of, you know, the advancement of civil rights. So finding, you know, information like that about a candidate can also be very instructive without necessarily needing to know about, you know, endorsements or, you know, maybe it's not a judge that got appointed. Maybe some of those other clues that people offered are not available. So that's my last tip too.
Thanks. So no one's asked this question, but this is a group of smart people, and I have a small amount of freak out about November. Not that small, I stay up at night. But it feels kind of, you know, in this sort of really uncertain time, it feels really looming. So we've talked a lot about the primary, which is in 2 weeks, which is great. But like, what are folks thinking or feeling about November 2020? Where are you at? Like, as far as like, we might, you know, feel pretty good about our state, but, you know, what about the rest of the country? We don't know how long the pandemic's gonna last. How are you feeling?
Well, I wanna offer my thanks to Megan for your great work in Wisconsin, because I'm from Wisconsin and my mom, who is a lifelong diehard progressive, did not vote for the first time in her life because she is quarantining alone and she has an autoimmune disorder. And she tried to get an absentee ballot and she didn't have a witness in the home and her computer's kind of old. And, you know, all the things that we know happen to people, particularly to low-income people that present these barriers. So I absolutely hope that other states move to vote by mail by November, because I'm very worried about our family members and our you know, states and our movements in other states around getting out the vote. And I feel very fortunate that we have vote by mail here in Oregon, and you know, we have some challenges, but hopefully, you know, just being able to cast your ballot is not the most major of those.
And I think one of the things that we all really have to continue to do is to press our congressional delegation, who by and large are working very, very hard to try to make election support part of one of the next COVID-19 support packages, whatever it is that Congress ultimately decides to do. It is absolutely critical that this next flow, that we don't wait too long, and that they actually commit to providing some money out to states that are going to have to try to make these transitions. And I know that all of our delegation, other than Congressman Walden, who seems to think everybody, since Oregon took 20 years to get complete, you know, to completely to vote by mail, everybody else should have to do the same 20 years, as opposed to relying on our experience, which is that it works. But so other than Congressman Walden, everybody I know is in favor of that, but hearing from you all that of all the crises that people need support for, our ability to maintain our democracy is one of them. So please keep that in mind for folks.
Oh, thank you for that. Anna, Samantha?
It's a big question. It's, you know, I acknowledge for myself, there's a lot of privilege in being able to worry about next year or December or November. So many of my immediate community is really worried about next paycheck, next, when is rent due. It's, it really is a function of trauma at this scale to paralyze you in this space and time. Not a whole lot of even school districts are thinking about the fall. We're really just trying to manage with what we have right now. And especially when you throw little ones into the mix or elders that folks are caring for, then that really exacerbates and just reduces the amount of brain space and emotional capacity we have for long-term planning. So that's very real right now in my vicinity. And that makes me feel not so pressured to have all the answers. We're really just focused on trying to get through as whole, as intact as possible. And then beyond that, doing our job as folks in this work in Oregon to do exactly that, which is promote the health of our democracy as much as we're promoting our physical and economic health. And really, again, threading for people that the global pandemic would have hit us entirely differently had we had some of the most critical structures in place that we do not have in Oregon. We do not have public childcare, right? We do not have healthcare that works for everyone. Like there are challenges that could have been prevented, or at least not as completely life-changing as they have been for a lot of folks right now. So there's going to be some recovery for folks in their immediate access to resources. And our job is to make sure that on top of resources, we remember that we want power, not just resources. And that means we have to organize and vote and turn out and demand so many things from so many leaders. But really, it's one step at a time for now.
Thanks. Okay. Samantha, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay, that's fine. Eric, I saw some head nods.
Sure. One day I'm optimistic, the next day I'm cynical. If we're to be, and it's just every day we wake up in a different scenario. And the cynic in me thinks that I won't even name him, we all know who he is, who continues to send horrible, mixed messages across the country, has no clear plan, or maybe his plan is to not have a clear plan to really mess things up for November, and is counting on COVID being worse and preventing people from getting out to vote. That's what the cynic in me says. The optimist, and I'm actually more an optimist than a cynic, but the optimist in me is that in paying attention to how people are reacting to this very clear either deception or just complete incompetence, is that they've had it. Why it's taken us to get there with this versus kids in cages, 3 years ago versus, transphobia and everything else just continually flummoxes me. But on the other hand, I'm cautiously optimistic with what I see in family members and folks who have never been political before being engaged, and so that's heartening. What I do know that queer folks have dealt with plagues before. They've dealt with difficult things. Everyone in this room tonight has dealt with this, and we are so much stronger than the people on the other side. And if we wake up, as I should know this date, and that's the November 3rd election, correct? So if we wake up on November 4th and we're in the same place we were 4 years ago, I know that we're going to pull it up and we're going to go back to work and we're just going to keep fighting. And what keeps me very much encouraged is that, there are groups of states that are banding together, not only I think on what's going on with COVID, but how we actually push back and we protect Americans who need it the most. And so, so there I am. That's where I am today. If you had asked me yesterday, maybe I would have stayed in the cynical, end of it. But I know we're all strong. I know we can fight back against this. This is an impressive group of folks that I'm very privileged to get to listen to tonight. So.
Thank you, Eric. So we actually just have a few minutes left. I want to share with everybody that we are, oh, I see a lag, but I just want to share with everybody that we are taking donations. We pay for the amazing live captioning, and we got a donation from our EPAC member, Shane Devins. Thank you very much. And from last week, we got a very generous donation from Laura and Paul Milne. Thank you so much for supporting keeping our Queer Town Hall accessible. And now I'm just going to do sort of a lightning round and let everybody make a closing comment about, how people can stay active and stay engaged in elections and in civic life these days. So I'm going to go, not to put anybody on the spot, but I'm going to just go alphabetical again and start at the top with Anna for your closing remarks.
Thank you. And I'm not sure if that lag is one person's end or not, but I'll try to work through it. One way to stay engaged. I mean, I think I'll just reiterate what I said before, which is continue to do your research and make sure that you're voting in all the races that you can vote for, that you're eligible to vote for. And really remember and try to remind other folks as well that it's so important. We're seeing now more than many other times that the people that are in power, for there to be a diversity in lived experience. A lot of the initial emergency response plans that came out of the legislature and the executive office were really silent on a lot of key pieces, right? Black, Indigenous, and communities of color was not mentioned not once in the Joint Committee's first response, right? Because what happens is, despite the fact that we've invested millions of dollars in diversity, equity, and inclusion training, when people get into crises like this, your brain reverts to, how do I protect me here and now? And it's harder to put on an equity lens versus if you bring with you inherently this lived experience, the solutions that you come up with are much more robust and leave fewer people behind. So that means it's even more important that we pay attention who is getting into office and how they're actually performing when they're in that office. Because times like this, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a massive earthquake, we're gonna need to know that we can trust and really rely on those that have the power. And we're seeing right now that we can't. I'm not saying that, I'm saying that I can't. So it's that much more important for us to carry on and continue the work and be prepared for this to be the long haul.
Thanks. Eric, I feel like you already gave me such a strong stay resilient message that I really appreciate and is so true. I'm going to move to Jeanne.
Again, to unmute. Well, two things. One very prosaic and pragmatic. Everybody get their ballots in. Now that we have a postage paid ballot, it's so easy and we can use the mail freely to do that. There still is a rule that it has to be in a clerk's hands by 8 o'clock on election night, not at the post office by 8 o'clock on election night. And so if you're getting within 5 or 6 days, or you're talking to somebody who's within 5 or 6 days of the election, find a ballot box because they have to unlock those boxes at 8 o'clock on election night, and those are the last ballots in. So that's just pragmatism. Taking very seriously what both Eric and Anna said. For those of us for whom it is a little easier, we now have even more reason to have to do our work. And we have important races in Oregon to fight about, but we're also, for our system, testing what it's might be like in November and hopefully coming up with an understanding where our system might fail. So important to do the analysis after the primary election. But like everybody else, my anger level and my optimism level varies several times throughout the day. And I admire all of you who are working all the time on it and not taking time to read books.
Thank you, Jeanne. Megan, you have a closing?
I just want to say thanks for having me as your guest. I hope that people feel like that, you know, I mean, I know there are so many lessons to be learned from Wisconsin, but about how, and that's not necessarily in a good way. So thanks for having me. And I have really enjoyed, you know, hearing from all of you. I think all of the comments that, you know, everybody has made are just right on. So yeah, it's just great to be a part of this, and thanks a lot.
Thank you. Samantha?
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to seeing the numbers, the turnout, the story. Really looking forward to seeing who gets elected and what experiences they're going to bring. I really recommend that you look at the lists of endorsements of Basic Rights, of Next Up Action Fund, Apano, ColorPAC, and think critically about who you want to send to the legislature. And also, if you have some time to go above and beyond voting, find a candidate who excites you and volunteer for them, or give them some cash if you can. I know not everyone has this privilege of time and of money right now, but it's really exciting to get to help make history. The candidate that I'm really, really excited about, for example, is Wednesday Campos. She would be the youngest person, the youngest woman ever elected to the legislature, and the youngest Latina ever. So I'm excited about her. There are many more candidates too who are helping to shape the new narrative of Oregon. And I know that Sammy's going to give a plug for this, but sign that petition for Yes on IP44, because it could really reform how our state approaches treatment and recovery. And we don't want to delay that anymore. So hit them up and sign it.
Thanks.
Thanks for that great segue, Samantha. You know, I think Oregonians have a tremendous opportunity. As terrifying as everything is in Oregon, you know, we really have a unique opportunity to not just play defense, but to make some really progressive wins, both on your primary ballot on May 19th and in the November election. And I think, you know, Oregon has really built up some momentum, even in the Trump era, in electing progressive candidates and enacting progressive policies. And thank you, Bro and Equality PAC, for your leadership in advancing equality for our communities. And, you know, the More Treatment campaign is part of that. We're going to have an opportunity on the November ballot to make a really exciting change, to turn the tide from how we criminalize and incarcerate people to have a more healthcare-based approach that's more important than ever now during the pandemic to get these services to vulnerable communities. So absolutely, please go to yesonip44.org and sign the petition. And we have lots more ways that are very easy to get involved in helping your neighbors sign the petition as well, and helping reach voters as we move closer to November. And we're almost there. We just need a small push to get over the finish line.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here tonight. I really appreciate the work you do in the world and the work you did tonight. Special thanks to Megan, calling in from Wisconsin. And, you know, I think for everybody out there, let's continue to make Oregon as great as we can. Let's be a North Star for progressive change, despite what's happening on the federal level. So thank you all. Have a good night. And we'll see you next week. Our topic will be immigration and immigrant rights during COVID. Thanks so much. Have a good night. Bye-bye.